At some point, without either of you deciding it on purpose, your relationship turned into a series of logistics. Who's picking up the kids? Whose turn it is to deal with the school email? Who's handling dinner? Who's handling bedtime? Who's handling the bill that's due Friday? If you're watching this, you already know the feeling I'm describing, because you're living inside it right now. The sense that you and your spouse have become extremely efficient coworkers running a household together. And somewhere along the way, the marriage part quietly checked out of the building. Stay with me, because what I'm about to explain is exactly how this happens, and more importantly, how you find your way back to being partners, instead of just partners in the corporate sense. Here's what almost nobody tells you before this happens. The transition from spouses to something closer to co-managers doesn't happen through one big event. There's no single day where you both decide to stop being romantic partners and start being operational ones. It happens through 1,000 small, reasonable decisions, each one making perfect sense in the moment, that quietly add up to a completely different relationship than the one you started with. It usually starts with logistics genuinely needing to be handled. Someone has to coordinate the calendar. Someone has to remember the pediatrician appointment. Someone has to manage the finances, the groceries, the school forms, the endless small administrative weight of running a household. And, if there are kids involved, raising them. In the beginning, handling all of this together can even feel like intimacy. You're building something, managing it as a team, and that shared competence feels good. But logistics have a way of expanding to fill every available conversation. And if you're not deliberately protecting space for anything else, the operational relationship doesn't stay contained to its own lane. It takes over the whole thing. The telltale sign that this has happened is usually in what your conversations actually consist of. If you mentally rewind your last 10 conversations with your spouse, how many of them were purely functional? Schedule coordination, task delegation, problem solving about the house or the kids or the finances, versus how many were about anything that wasn't a logistical necessity. For a lot of couples living this pattern, the honest answer is that almost none of the recent conversation had nothing to do with running the household. And if that's true for you, it's worth sitting with what that actually means. Because a relationship that only exists inside the space of necessary logistics isn't really a marriage anymore in the way you probably mean when you use that word. It's a very well-run operation with two competent people at the helm. There's a reason this particular pattern is so easy to fall into and so hard to notice while it's happening. And it's because it doesn't feel bad in an obvious way. Nobody's yelling, nobody's crying. The house runs smoothly. Bills get paid on time. The kids are fed and picked up, and their homework gets checked. From the outside, and often even from the inside, this can look like a functioning, successful family. The problem is that functioning and connected are two completely different things, and a lot of couples don't notice the gap between them until it's been open for years. Let's talk honestly about what gets lost specifically when a marriage slides into this operational mode. The first thing to go is usually curiosity. The habit of actually asking your partner questions that have nothing to do with the logistics of the day, and genuinely wanting to know the answer. Early in a relationship, you probably asked each other things constantly. What are you thinking about? What's been on your mind? What do you actually want out of life these days? Those questions require time and attention that logistics don't leave much room for, and they're the first casualty when the schedule gets tight. The second thing to go is usually physical affection that isn't functional, meaning touch that isn't a hug goodbye on the way out the door or a peck on the cheek in passing, but touch that exists purely because you wanted to be close to each other. This kind of affection requires a sense of romantic availability that's hard to access when your nervous system has been in task management mode all day. And it quietly disappears from a lot of marriages, not because attraction died, but because there was never a moment carved out where it had space to exist. The third thing to go, and this one is the most dangerous because it's the hardest to notice, is the sense of being known by your partner as a full person, rather than as a functional half of a household unit. You can run an incredibly efficient family with someone and still feel like they have almost no idea what's actually happening inside you. Your private fears, your evolving sense of who you are, the parts of yourself that have nothing to do with your role as a parent or a spender or a scheduler. When that sense of being known fades, it leaves behind a very specific kind of loneliness. The kind that's especially disorienting because you're not physically alone at all. You're sharing a bed, a bank account, a life with someone who genuinely doesn't know what's going on with you anymore. And you might not know what's going on with them either. Before I go further, I want to name something. If any of this sounds familiar, conversations that are almost entirely logistics, touch that's become purely functional, feeling like you're running an efficient operation instead of a marriage, you're not failing. You just built a system that's really good at managing a household and never protected room for anything else. That's actually why I put together the Complete Marriage Rescue Trilogy, 3 step-by-step guides for every stage of a marriage crisis, including exactly this kind of drift, with concrete ways to rebuild the parts that got quietly set aside. The link is in the first comment below. I'll come back to it before we're done. Now, here's where this pattern tends to hit hardest, and why the busy season you're waiting to pass might never actually end on its own. There's a particular version of this that hits especially hard for a lot of couples with young children, because parenting genuinely does require an enormous amount of operational coordination. And it's very easy to tell yourselves that the current stretch is just a busy season, a temporary phase you'll get through, and the real relationship will come back once things calm down. Sometimes that's true, but often the busy season never fully ends. One demanding stretch gives way to another, and the operational habits formed during the hardest years quietly become the permanent operating system of the marriage. Because nobody ever went back and deliberately rebuilt the parts that got set aside out of necessity. It's worth being honest, too, about how gender roles often shape this pattern, even in relationships that consider themselves equal and modern. One partner often ends up as the default project manager of the household, tracking what needs to happen, when, and by whom, even if the actual physical tasks are shared. That mental load, the constant background tracking of everything that needs attention, is exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who isn't the one carrying it. And it often leaves the person carrying it with almost no bandwidth left over for the kind of relaxed, unstructured connection that romance actually needs to breathe. Here's something worth understanding about what happens to desire specifically in this kind of relationship. Attraction and romantic interest generally need some sense of mystery, spontaneity, or at least variation to stay alive. Some sense that your partner is a whole, still unfolding person, rather than a completely known, fully mapped out operational partner. When every interaction becomes logistics and every conversation is predictable in its content, the relationship starts to feel less like a romance and more like a long-running professional partnership with excellent communication and zero chemistry. This isn't because the love disappeared. It's because the specific conditions that keep romantic interest alive got quietly starved out by an environment that only ever asked you to be reliable, competent, and efficient with each other. There's also a subtle resentment that tends to build in this pattern, and it's worth naming directly because it rarely gets said out loud. When a relationship becomes primarily operational, both partners can end up quietly evaluating each other the way you'd evaluate a business partner, based on reliability, output, whether they're pulling their weight, rather than the way you'd experience someone you're in love with. That evaluative lens is useful for running a household. It's corrosive for a marriage, because it trains both of you to see each other's failures and shortcomings through the lens of performance, rather than through the lens of grace that partners in an actual romantic relationship extend to each other. So what does it actually look like to rebuild the marriage underneath the operation you've built together? The first shift is recognizing that this isn't going to happen by accident, the same way the operational drift didn't happen by accident either. It happened through 1,000 small choices, And reversing it requires an equally deliberate set of small choices in the other direction. Waiting for a slow season, waiting for the kids to get older, waiting for work to calm down, is usually waiting for a moment that never actually arrives. Because life tends to fill whatever space you leave open with more logistics rather than less. Concretely, this means protecting specific time that has an explicit rule attached to it. No logistics allowed. Not a general date night where the conversation drifts back to the school schedule within 10 minutes, but a genuinely protected space where you've both agreed in advance that talking about the house, the kids' logistics, or the finances is off limits. Precisely because those topics are so magnetic that they'll fill every available minute if you let them. This might feel artificial at first, almost like a rule imposed on something that should happen naturally. That's fine. Most couples in this pattern need the artificial structure initially, because the natural inclination toward logistics is exactly the habit you're trying to interrupt. It also helps enormously to deliberately ask each other questions you don't already know the answer to, on purpose, as a practice, rather than waiting for them to arise organically. Things like, what's something you've been thinking about lately that we haven't talked about? Or, what's something you're looking forward to that has nothing to do with the kids or the house? These questions can feel strange or even a little performative at first, especially if it's been a long time since you asked each other anything that wasn't functional. That initial awkwardness is normal, and it fades much faster than people expect once the habit starts to rebuild. It's also worth being intentional about touch that has no functional purpose attached to it, not initiating physical affection as a lead-up to something else, and not just the quick, habitual gestures of a long relationship, but touch that exists purely to communicate, I still want to be close to you as a person, separate from anything either of you needs from the other today. This can feel oddly vulnerable to reintroduce after a long stretch of operational distance, precisely because it has no functional cover story. That vulnerability is actually the point. It's what signals that you're relating to each other as partners again, not just as co-managers being efficient with each other. There's a version of this repair that also requires a harder, more honest conversation, which is naming the operational pattern directly to your partner, rather than just quietly trying to change your own behavior and hoping they notice. Something like, I've realized almost everything we talk about lately is logistics, and I miss actually knowing what's going on with you as a person, not just as my co-parent or the person I split bills with. I want us to be partners again, not just running a really efficient operation together. This kind of statement can feel exposing to say, because it names something that's been true for a while without either of you acknowledging it directly. But naming it accurately is usually what finally interrupts a pattern that's been running on autopilot for a long time. It's worth adding one honest caveat here. Rebuilding connection underneath years of operational habit rarely happens instantly, and it's common for the first few attempts at unstructured, non-logistical time together to feel stilted or even a little boring, simply because the muscle for it has atrophied from disuse. That doesn't mean it's not working. It usually means you're both relearning a skill you used to have naturally and lost through years of prioritizing efficiency over connection. And like any skill you're relearning, the first attempts are often clumsy before they become natural again. Where this leaves you, right now, sitting inside a marriage that runs beautifully as a household and feels strangely hollow as a relationship, is somewhere genuinely hopeful, even if it doesn't feel that way yet. The fact that you can run a household this efficiently together means the partnership skills are already there. The trust, the reliability, the ability to coordinate complex things without falling apart. What's missing isn't the foundation. It's the deliberate decision to use some of that same partnership energy to rebuild the romantic and personal connection that got quietly deprioritized while you were both busy keeping everything else running. Everything we've talked about today is the diagnosis, how a marriage quietly becomes an operation, one reasonable decision at a time. But understanding how it happened is only half of it. The other half is having an exact way to rebuild, protected time with real rules, questions you don't already know the answers to, touch with no functional purpose attached. That's exactly what the Complete Marriage Rescue Trilogy gives you. 3 guides for every stage a marriage goes through, including a set of reconnection principles with a concrete same-day exercise, so rebuilding doesn't stay theoretical. The link is in the first comment below. Go check it out the moment this video ends. Before we end today, here's the one thing I want you to take with you. Running a family well together is genuinely an accomplishment, and it matters. But it was never supposed to be the whole marriage. Somewhere underneath the schedule and the logistics and the endless coordinating, there are still 2 people who chose each other for reasons that had nothing to do with efficiency. Finding your way back to those 2 people doesn't require blowing up the operation you've built. It just requires deciding, on purpose, to be more than business partners to each other again.